Hello, everybody. It's Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. My name is Scott Maier. This is Drawing Together with Artists Network, where we meet every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. So if you're new to the show, I want to welcome you, and I want to welcome all the familiar names that I see here from all the familiar places. So it's been great working with all of you. If you are new, I want to let you know a bit about what this show is about. This is all about taking some time out of our busy lives to draw. So we take just an hour or two each week, choose a new subject to tackle that's designed to help us advance our skills in a specific way. Fairly traditional drawing, so we use graphite and charcoal, but I encourage you to use this as an opportunity to really discover something about your own unique trajectory as an artist. You can find a link to the image in the description below, as well as a list of the materials and a link to the page on artistnetwork.com where you can share your work when you're done. So that's always awesome. I love seeing all the images that you all share of the work. All right, and if you are joining us live, feel free to ask any questions, make any comments, observations, work amongst yourselves. So if you do have any questions, I'm going to do my best to answer them, but I also encourage you, as you're watching, to provide your own unique take. So again, that's really kind of what this show is all about. It's about us getting together to draw, to share these ideas. I'm going to talk through what I kind of think about as I navigate the drawing, and hopefully it'll be something that can help you as well. So throw it all out there if you have any questions, observations, comments. All right, let's get to it. So I'm going to switch the screen here. This is what we're working on today. You can see that image below me of these haystacks. Again, you can find a link to the reference image in the description below. I chose this subject for a variety of reasons. There are several opportunities that we have available to us with this subject. The first is as we deal with form. This is something that came out of the last Drawing Together episode, the idea of doing something cylindrical. I took that and kind of rotated it on its side here with these hay bales. So we're dealing with that cylindrical form. We're dealing with the light and shadow as we navigate that transition from the light on the face of the hay bale to the shadow on the side, as well as some of the reflected light and the transitions, those gradients in that shadow side. We have that cast shadow, which is going to be a lot of fun to deal with. Two other things that I think are going to be really helpful here, really looking at cross-contour information. So with this hay bale, we can use that texture, which is the third thing, to help us really reinforce the form of the subject. And it's something we talk about in this and show quite a bit. So as we really engage with texture, I want to be thinking about it in such a way that it's reinforcing the form. It's not something that's applied to the form later, but it's baked into the process. And with this, we can see a lot of that cross-contour information here that's describing the texture as well as the three-dimensional form of the hay bale. So those are the three things. We have the cylindrical form, and we have the texture, as well as the cross-contour information are the three things that really stood out for me. So texture is going to be a big thing in this one. If you don't have the same materials, feel free to use whatever you've got available. Hopefully the things that we'll be talking about will be applicable to any medium that you're working with. Let's see. Yeah, and I think I'm working with graphite today, so I think really pretty much any standard drawing paper should work. What I'm actually working with, though, is the Legion. Let me bring this up so you can see it, the Stonehenge white. So this is a cotton rag paper. This is a 9x12. I love the rag papers. It's a wonderful tooth. So it gives you that blend of enough tooth to be able to really build up layers of the graphite, but it's not so rough that it becomes problematic when you're dealing with kind of refinements. So that's what I have here. For the graphite, I have a stick of graphite. This is a 2B that I'm just going to use to build up some of the initial layers. And then I have these Faber-Castell Pitt matte graphites, graphite matte, and a variety of them. So a 2B, 6B, and a 14B. I have a bias towards the softer, darker graphites, and I really enjoy these quite a bit. Really rich tone that they create there. But you may not it's not always common to see something that gets as dark as a 14B. If you have a kind of a full range and it happens to be a little bit lighter, I think you'll be able to do just fine. For erasers, I have my Derwent retractable eraser, which I do need to order a new one soon because I'm almost out. I have a small Kneaded eraser, and then for blending, I just simply have my well-used graphite blending stump here. I called it my graphite blending stump because I use it only for graphite. But this is a tortillon that I like to use, and I like them, the more used, the better. And then I have a paper towel here as well. All right, so I see some questions up here, so I'm going to answer those, and then we'll get started. Let's see. I don't know. A Lollipop Strawberry has a question, and also if we can use Creolando pencil. I don't know. I don't know what that is, but I think you can use whatever you want. I think it'll all work. I have a process by which I'm really manipulating the material on the page. I like to use additive and subtractive processes. So if you do have something like colored pencil or pen and ink where it's really an additive medium, it's very difficult to erase, then it might be a little bit different in terms of the process, but hopefully the concepts will be applicable. Okay. And Christiane has a question about the Gustavo Ramos video. So as Artist Network members, you would have had access on the, like a week or so ago to watch a conversation with Gustavo Ramos. And that should be on the Artist Network site, the replay of that. So if you have the confirmation email, it should be there. If not, if you go to Artist Network, under the membership, you'll see the events section that you can click on, and that'll bring up all the past events, and there they'll have them listed, and you should be able to access the recording from there as well. So hopefully that helps. Check it out. It was a really cool conversation. He is an amazing artist. This month we have Brianne Brown coming. She's a watercolor painter, so I'm very excited for that one. Okay, let's get to it. Again, I have my stick of graphite here. I took some time, this is a new one, I took some time beforehand just to kind of break it in. You can see that it's a little curved on one side, and if I use it this way, there's a kind of a reverse camber, which means the ends are making contact with the paper, but not the center. So I took some time to identify the sides that are going to help me tone the paper, but I want to get some tone on the paper right away. And the reason I want to do this is because just based on the subject that I'm observing, it's going to be challenging to deal with the light. And what I'm doing is I could feel it, the surface of the board coming through the paper a bit too much. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to put something in underneath it. So this is something I do quite a bit. I like a hard surface on which to draw, but this is transferring the texture of the board underneath it too much. And so I'm going to just lift this up real quick. And I want to be careful because sometimes this paper can cause, the tape can rip the paper some, and that can cause some trouble. All right, so just slid that, another sheet underneath it, and that should make for a, not necessarily smoother, but I can engage with the tooth of the paper just as it is without also contending with the texture of the board underneath it. And I want to tone the whole paper again just to knock down the highlights there. So getting kind of back to that, looking at the reference image, one of the challenges is going to be managing the value relationship between the highlights on the lit side of the hay bale and the values in the sky. Because what we have here is a really nice color contrast with that blue sky, that golden hay bale. We have a situation where we have values that might be closer to one another, but we have a high color contrast that makes that hay bale really kind of stand out. We're getting a lot of definition there. And when we're translating those high chroma areas and those areas that are similar in value but contrasting in terms of color, we have to start to make some decisions. How do we translate the contrast in color into a value contrast in such a way that it still makes sense? So in this way, I'm going to, I think, ultimately darken the sky just slightly and isolate the highlights in the in that lit side of the hay bale. So that's why I'm toning the paper, and hopefully, if that makes no sense what I'm saying right now, as we get through it, it'll hopefully make more sense. All right. And when I'm toning the paper, you can see that I'm using a lot of light layers, mostly just using the weight of the pencil itself, changing up the direction of the marks. And if I see an area that is too kind of obviously light, I'll tighten up the marks, apply a little bit more pressure, and then kind of feather it out on top. And now this doesn't have to be perfectly smooth, and I will show some techniques for smoothing out an area where you may feel that it's too rough. Nia, happy birthday! Glad you could make it, and I hope it was an enjoyable day. Ooh, Tammy's going to try a colored pencil. That's pretty awesome. All right, so just kind of toning that down. I'm going to take the harder graphite, the 2B, so this is actually the same scale, but it's going to be a slightly different tone. Each company kind of calibrates their value scales a little bit differently. So I have the small thumbnail on the screen in front of me, and that's what I'm going to be working from. That is because it helps me to identify kind of the whole form and not get absorbed in the details too much early on. And that's not showing up a whole lot, but that's okay. I can see it a little bit more clearly. Hopefully you can see it clearly enough. I need to kind of orient myself a little bit. And I think in this initial gesture, what I want to do is just simply get some marks on the paper and not concern myself with their accuracy at this point. We'll move on to correcting once we have something established on the page. I've kind of fallen into this process just because when I've taken the time to map out forms linearly, essentially creating an outline and then filling it in, I'm often doing that initial mapping early on in the drawing before I've really taken much time with the subject. And that's part of what drawing allows us to do, is it slows our observations down so that we can really take time to engage with the subject. And by the end of the drawing, we will have sat with the subject for a couple hours, and we will have a deeper understanding of the subject. And so that's when I want my marks to reflect that depth of observation and understanding, not at the very beginning. So these early marks are really about setting a foundation from which I can correct and continually adjust. I'm using the side of the pencil because these marks tend to float on the surface a little bit more. than if I were to use the tip of the pencil, which embosses the page to some degree. And when we get into the texture, actually, some of that embossing will become advantageous to us. So, but at this point, I don't really want them. So what I'm doing is creating a rough shape for light and shadow here. Using the kneaded eraser, I'll do some subtractive drawing. And I'm not worried about making it clean or precise here. If I'm looking at anything at this stage, I'm just looking at the major shapes and trying to be aware of any strong directional marks. So I'm changing up the direction of my marks quite frequently. And then we'll take a look at the basic proportions in the scene to see what we can learn from the subject. At this stage too, as I'm roughing in with this initial gesture, I'm also looking for the shadow shape. So there are three main shadow terms that I think are helpful to know. There's a form shadow. So in this case, we can see that very clearly. We have the light side and we have the shadow side. So this is what's called the form shadow. It's the shadow on the form, on the subject. So where we have a light side and we have a shadow side. And we see some variation within that shadow side. From the darkest darks down here, we see some reflected light up here. That's the form shadow, and it's also casting a shadow, so it's creating this cast shadow on the ground. When you squint your eyes, though, you can see that they really merge together into one shape. Their value relationships are much more closely aligned than either of these are to anything in the surrounding area. So what I'm looking for is that shadow shape, which is the combination of the two, and from there I will try to distinguish the two, try to distinguish the cast shadow from the form shadow as needed. So as I kind of rough in that horizon line, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm resting my wrist here on this bar, and I can use that to help orient myself laterally across there. And you can do a quick check-in to gauge the height across there and say it's largely a straight line and parallel to the top and bottom. Let's see, Dale, it's a question about sharpening. I quickly can show you that here. I'll pull up a paper towel, but it's really just using a razor blade. And, kind of push with my thumb into there. And one of the things I really like about these Faber-Castell pencils is that there's no kind of glue that I'm contending with here. Sometimes with various pencils, you'll feel that glue that holds the core of the pencil and the casing together. And so it's really just a matter of this. I'm just kind of pushing and scraping and rolling in my fingers to round it out. And that gets me a relatively sharp point. And then by using the side of the pencil as I'm doing and rolling it in my fingers, you can see I can really engage quite a bit of the pencil on the side of the paper. And by rolling it, I'm constantly rounding out, and I'm actually refining the point so that I have that sharper edge when I need it. Let's see. The dimensions, it's about an 11 by 14. I can't remember quite exactly the dimensions of the reference image. This is a 9 by 12 paper, but it gives me a little bit more height above here than what we're seeing in the reference image. So I'm adding a little bit of that sky. All right, so roughing in that spot there in the center. And I want to kind of rough in that Bale that's in the background there. I'm going to bring down that horizon line. This is going to be a little challenging today because when I did that preparatory sketch, I was able to rotate the paper, and I'm not going to be able to do that today. So, because I have it all taped down, so that'll be fun. Okay, so now that I have it kind of roughed in, I'm just going to erase a little bit from here. I'm going to do a little bit of measuring. And the first thing that I like to do when measuring is I start with angle sighting. And you don't have a lot of angles initially that you may identify, but I actually use that quite a bit in this. So what I'm looking for is I'm looking at these circular forms and then trying to break them down into shorter straight marks. So we can see that this isn't a perfectly cylindrical form. There are variations in it that make this curve highly specific, and that's what we're looking for. So by creating this oval through observations of these shorter, straighter marks, you will ultimately end at something that's a bit more specific. And so I'm just kind of mapping that out now. And I'm going more by kind of gut feel at this point. So I'm looking at the reference image. And then out of my peripheral vision, I can see what's happening on the screen next to it. And kind of moving back and forth, comparing the two. And then we'll compare that using angle sighting. And I'll get into that a little bit as soon as I finish kind of roughing in these shapes here. We can really see that this background hay bale here is kind of flattened out on the bottom and it's kind of leaning to one side, which to me just adds to the character of the piece. It kind of bulges a little bit back there. Okay, now we're going to also get into a little bit of perspective here. And I'm bringing that up because I've noticed that there can be a lot of variation about how perspective is used in drawings. When we introduce that, you may introduce perspective earlier on than I do. I like to use linear perspective as a way to double check my observations, not to build a drawing from that linear perspective, if that makes sense. But you may have a different take on it. You may prefer to kind of map out the perspective first and then kind of build up some of these tones. So I want to bring that into the conversation now, just so that, again, it's something that you're aware of and not seeing this as a statement that I'm making about this is how all drawings should be made. Okay, so what I'm going to look for now are these primary divisions here. If I look at these sections here, I want to compare that to what I'm looking at in the reference image. This is comparative measuring. So I'm going to take this measurement here from the right side edge to the left of the hay bale, and I'm going to carry that over and compare that to what I have here. So if I were to take that same measurement, then if I carry it over to the left, an equal distance should bring me just right of the center of the hay bale. And what I'm observing in the reference image is that this distance here should equal this distance. And you can see there's quite a bit of variation there. So I'm just going to make that mental note. And now I'm going to take this measurement and compare it across here. And this measurement should take me across to right about there. Yeah, about 2/3 of the way over onto this here. So I've got some basic measurements that are correct and some that need work. So now I need to figure out, what do I adjust from here? If I look over here, I can see that there's quite a bit of distance there. I know that the top proportion here is going to be a little bit off because my paper is slightly taller than the reference image. Now, if I bring this over, if I widen this, so if I take this and keep this width here the same, I need to figure out what the lateral distance is from this point to this point. So I'm going to compare what I see when I compare that in my reference image. If I take this distance here, carry it across, it should equal essentially to the left side of the central dark spot. So I got to bring this over. So I think what I need to do is I need to just carry this side over here, bring that out a little bit more. And I'm using the side of my pencil intentionally here so that I'm making these corrective marks in a way that it's easy to erase and adjust later. All right, so I just brought that over just about maybe 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch, and let's see how this compares. It's getting closer. And it should be, if I take this measurement here, it should equal right about here, this distance here. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to use some angle sighting. And I feel like what ends up happening is actually I have to adjust this angle here. So with angle sighting, I'm closing one eye and laying my pencil so it appears to be directly on top of the reference image, locking my wrist, carrying it over so it appears to be directly on the paper. And that way I'm comparing the angle of the reference to the angle on the paper, just so. Now, this is a technique that I use a lot when working from observation. So I also want to put out there that working from life will give you far more opportunities for growth than working from photograph. You know, saying that, though, working from a photograph can help advance your skills quite a bit also. So if you ever get a chance to work from life, I think it'll be highly beneficial. The key thing is to keep drawing, though. Okay. Now let me check this. That feels quite a bit better, and I might have to bump this out a little bit more. And I'll keep adjusting this. And this is why kind of part of my process is to measure a little bit later on after the gesture. I've sat with the subject a little bit more, and my observation of the proportions is going to be a little bit more accurate. Now I can move this over just a touch, and I'm looking at the relationship between the negative space. So the distance here, this distance here compared to this. And I am thinking that feels a little bit better. So I want to compare this again. Feels about right. So right now, my measurements are approximate, but I'm narrowing the field a bit more. Pun intended there. and I'm feeling a little bit better. I want to compare the angles here, the top of this, and to the bottom in that shadow core. And then the bottom here across the face that's in light. All right, so this is where I can start to bring in some tips about perspective. Now, again, this is not perfectly symmetrical, but one thing I feel confident that we can identify is that this darker spot here represents the middle of that hay bale. It being in perspective, though, you can see that this angle across here is slightly sloped here. So it's not a horizontal line. There's an angle to it. We're looking kind of across the face of that. And while this may be in the center of the hay bale, optically, it's going to be pushed back a bit. Following the rules of perspective, it's not going to be placed directly in the center. And what you can do is you can try to roughly find the box here for the face of the hay bale here. And hopefully you can see that. And if I look at that, the perspective seems to be, you know, perhaps all right. See, we've got the horizon line here. This line here and this line here should all appear to meet. If you were to extend them far enough, they would appear to meet at a single point off in the distance. I think this has got to come down a little bit like that. That feels a little bit better. Now, to find perspective center, so find the center of this square where it should be given the rules of perspective, all you have to do is connect the opposing corners, and where they intersect is perspective center. So that can shift this over just a bit there. So that can be a helpful tool. And then also by finding perspective center, if you run a vertical line through that, it indicates the top of this cylinder here and the bottom of the cylinder as drawn in perspective. Now, if you were to measure these lines across, you can see that there's more distance here than there is over here, again, because of perspective. This half is closer to us than this half, and you have this receding of those forms. And then with this indicating the top of the hay bale, we should roughly be able to identify the kind of the imaginary lines running along the top and bottom of the forms, and they should appear to roughly meet at a vanishing point far off the page over here. So this is roughly 2-point perspective that we're seeing, and then we have this drawn in mostly 1-point perspective. Now, because they're not parallel with one another, I'm not going to use the same vanishing points for this as I do for this one. So that is the big difference here. If these two hay bales were perfectly aligned and parallel with one another, then we could actually use the same vanishing point. So I'm not gonna use perspective on this. I'm just gonna draw it kind of optically and by reaction there. Laura, oh, welcome. Ambar and Leon. Welcome. I hope you are enjoying their drawing here with your aunt. And then we have a question. How can I achieve more confident lines in drawing? That's a really good question. I'm gonna think about that. I want to read through some of the questions, and I'm going to get back to you because I have a feeling that I'm going to end up talking a bunch, and I want to make sure I get to these questions. Okay, Wilma has a great comment there about the reference image, and for Dahlia, sorry, it's a little far away from me. The screen is. So Dahlia, these are Faber-Castell, the Pitt Graphite Matte pencils that I've been trying out. I really enjoy these. Right now, I'm working with the 2B. And then I also have the 6B and the 12B. This comes in a range here that goes all the way up to 14B. It comes with an eraser, sharpener, blending stump as well. So it's a good set. All right, so hopefully the perspective made sense. Yeah, Thomas, I'll be sure to chill with the puns. I start bailing. That's part of the thing. I love coming up with the puns for the titles. All right, so back to the question about I'm having a hard time reading it. Remember, how can I avoid more confident lines in drawing? Okay, I'm going to keep drawing while I think about that because that is a really good question. In general, what confidence represents is simply the idea that your subconscious is starting to take over. It's gotten to the point where you don't have to really think about it anymore. It's not something your brain is still kind of getting accustomed to. And that comes through just experience. But I also feel like that experience, it comes through deliberate practice. You know, the more you draw, the more confident you're going to get. The more variety of mark making you work into your process, the greater control you have, and I think that's ultimately going to lead to greater confidence. And so what I mean by that is I like to draw on this overhand grip quite a bit. And right now I'm holding it between my two fingers. Sometimes I'll switch and I'll use this kind of modified tripod grip and I'll draw like that. Sometimes I'll hold the pencil like this. Sometimes I'll hold the pencil in the tripod grip like this. I don't really think about it anymore, but I've worked with all of those various grips over the years, and I know how to kind of switch in between them, or I have an intuition about when to switch in between them, and that might be different for me than it might be for you, but I think the best way to really master your material is to work into your process instances where you're really trying to replicate the image in front of you. Like you have a very clear goal. I'm going to make this drawing look exactly like this. And that's going to teach you a certain amount of control. But then vary that with exercises where you're going to intentionally ignore all of that and try to draw, quote unquote, badly. That is where you discover new forms of mark making and new ways of holding the pencil. You're going to discover your own way of kind of navigating a drawing. I think one of the things that can happen is we get stuck trying to feel like each drawing has to be done correctly, and that prevents us from discovering opportunities that happen when we do things incorrectly. So hopefully that makes sense. Also, working with a variety of media really helps. So working with charcoal, working graphite, pen and ink, Conte, all of those things, they force you to engage with the materials in a different way. And you never know when working with pen and ink, you'll pick up something that is useful in graphite, or using Conte, maybe there's something there that is useful when you're working with charcoal. And again, it all comes down to deliberate practice, and trying to abandon the idea that each drawing should be done to perfection. Some drawings should intentionally be done imperfectly. And that's part of what we try to model here in this series, is that this is about the exercise of it. You know, I'm not doing anything here with the intention of showing the work, you know, aside from all of you, but, you know, I'm not creating a piece to be shown in a gallery or anything. This is an exercise designed to help train my brain and my hand-eye coordination. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, let me bring out the paper towel here and start blending. So just with these circular marks here, I was doing some stuff there while I was thinking about confident marks, and I want to kind of talk about what I'm doing. So I'm building up these layers, and And now what I'm doing is I'm taking my my kneaded eraser. You know what I need to do? It's this. That is there. I needed to lock. I needed an exposure lock on my my phone's camera there because it was continually adjusting. Okay, so I'm finding the dark areas now, kind of gently tapping and then feathering out. And I think it's helpful to stand your work up vertically and step back from it, because these are matte graphite pencils, so I get much less shine than I normally do. But even then, just because of the surface of the paper, things look differently when I'm looking at this angle versus the vertical projection that I see in front of me. And it's what's in front of me that I ultimately want to be gauging my decisions on, because that's going to be the more correct observation. I'm not calibrating to the perspective distortion of this slant that I have in front of me. So with the kneaded eraser, I'm going to kind of play around with a few different ways of kind of modulating it. So I kind of flattened it out. I'm going to drag it and try to feather it a little bit, change the direction of my marks. And if anybody else has any suggestions on, if you've got kind of techniques, tools, exercises that you use to help you gain confidence in your mark making, may already be happening in the thread here, but throw that out there. Tammy, are you committed to the color pencil? Yeah, the erasing is harder to do a colored pencil. An electric eraser sometimes works a little bit better. I'm actually working on a drawing in colored pencil right now, and it's a lot of fun, but it is very different. And I find that, and to kind of reinforce the point I was just making, that I find it really beneficial. Okay, so I'm moving into essentially the third phase of the drawing. If I can break my drawing process down into 4 phases, starts with a gesture, kind of a roughing into the form. It moves on to measuring. Then you refine the shapes, and then you bring it to completion. And it's in this stage that I tend to spend a little bit more time really refining the shapes. So I'm going to talk about some of the decisions I make. And the more time you spend in this third phase, the more you're going to be able to rely on the power of suggestion to confront some of those details. Because what I like about this process is that it puts me in control of how much or how little detail I want in the work, or refinement is what I like to refer to it as. Some days I would want to get in there and get every little detail. Some days I would want to leave the drawing just as it is right now. If I had initiated this process by, say, finishing one section, moving on to another and finishing that, etc., that kind of locks me in to completing the drawing in that same manner. So by building it all up at once, not only does it allow me to kind of continually move and massage the forms a bit, but it allows me to think through really what kind of experience I want to have in the final drawing here. Again, that's the process that I outline in my book. So next Tuesday, my book comes out, and it'll be, anybody who's pre-ordered it, it should be shipped to you, I think, starting next Tuesday. So, but that's all about, it's very similar to this exercise here, where it's about finding projects that you can do that help you advance your skills in particular ways. So you find information on that in the description below too. Okay, so as I'm refining the form, right now I'm just using observation, going back and forth between the small thumbnail on the screen in front of me and then the drawing. And one of the things that I want to shift my attention to now are the edges. And this is a strong edge right here. But there are areas in it that are sharper and more defined than others. And so I'm using this kind of tighter circular mark along this edge and then feathering it out back. And I'm not being too careful with the direction of my marks. Now, one of the things that kind of stands out to me is that we talk about the direction of marks quite a bit, how important they are. And there are often times where with an edge like this, I want to actually change the direction of my mark. If I have a curve like this, maybe I want to move my mark in this way. In this case, if anything, I want my marks here to really reinforce the cylindrical form here that's carrying this curve back in space. That's going to reinforce the form. And by doing that, by saying that these marks run in the same direction as this edge, so they must belong together, that helps to unify the form. Your brain looks at those marks and says, all right, if this is the shape of the curve, these marks are running in that direction, they must be part of the same form. If I move over here and now I'm working on the background and I'm moving my marks so that they're parallel with this edge, the brain is going to do the same thing. It says, well, they're moving in the same direction, so they must belong together. But they don't. This is much farther back in space. I want to create some spatial separation there. And I can reinforce that by changing the direction of my marks so that they're running contrary to this curve here, if that makes sense. We already have this nice overlapping of the form here, where we have this line that cuts through these various pieces of the hay bales, and we can amplify that depth by then changing the direction of the marks. So it's a very subtle thing. You may end up achieving the same value, but it can make or break a drawing simply by looking at the direction of the marks. And now if we look in the background, it's all, the ground plane, I'm sorry, it's all kind of vertically oriented kind of grass marks. So in here, I can be free to keep these running vertically. And we'll talk about creating depth along that grass plane as we move forward. So just something to kind of keep in mind, and don't chastise yourself if you catch yourself making marks that aren't moving in the right direction. It's just, in general, if you can kind of have that in the back of your mind, it can be helpful. Here, I'll just, as I get along this edge, I'll try to fill that in with some other marks here. So you can see that I'm starting to create the contrast of light and shadow by bringing everything else down. I'm not trying to preserve the white of the paper. Okay. Well, Macintosh, you can use those Inktense pencils. Those are a lot of fun. Yeah, those are quite a lot of fun. Okay, so back to this shape here. I'm sticking with this 2B graphite. It's not getting me nearly as dark as I need to, but that's not really what I'm focusing on right now. I'm focusing on the form. So where I'm looking at are edges that are a little bit sharper, like this. So we move up along this edge, it breaks apart a little bit, and then it sharpens up a little bit more over here, even though it gets a little bit darker in here as well. And if you don't really know what direction to make your marks, use a circular mark, and it's fairly omnidirectional. So again, I'm just using the side of the pencil, and as I block in these forms, I'm slowly rotating the pencil, rolling it in my fingers so that I end up with rounded spots there. And as I get closer to the edge, that's where I can kind of slow down my marks and start to really look at the form. So up along here, we see that contrast between the shadow form and then the sky. So I'm going to try to find that edge and work back and forth away from that edge and then back up to it. Not drawing a line, but I'm trying to find an edge. That's so much of drawing is about discovering the forms on the page. There's a slight delay between what I'm doing here and what I'm capturing on the camera above. But it is helpful to be looking at that camera. Now, the other reason I prefer this process is that it aligns very closely with my process for landscape painting. That's kind of one of the sub-objectives for this show is that drawing can be very helpful with our other forms of artwork. It helps us make faster decisions. It improves our hand-eye coordination. It helps us understand composition and other fundamental aspects of art making a little bit more deeply. All right, so if you do have to change the direction of your mark, one of the things that you can also be aware of is the perspective of the form as it recedes away in this direction here. Remember, this is drawn in two-point perspective. So what I like to do is identify where the horizon line is, and that's going to be horizontal along that cylinder. And then we have kind of the bottom of the cylinder roughly down in here. We identify that angle. And as I'm moving down, I'm going to slowly try to transition between that horizontal mark and the slight angle down in here. And then the same as we move above that, make sure I can identify this angle here. And then slowly transition into making increasingly horizontal marks until I get down to that horizon line. Getting a little bit lighter up in here. That's the other thing I observe. That's a very soft edge there. And that helps to create that turning edge, to create that sense of volume. Rasim, hello, from Turkey, huh? Welcome, welcome. If anybody else is new, let us know where you're viewing from. Mary, viewing from Australia. Pia in Switzerland. A lot of people, a lot of familiar names and places. Okay, so this is slowly becoming more refined. I'm going to move over to this form here. Now, one of the things that you can also be using to your advantage is positive and negative space. So I can use this shape here to help define the curve of this hay bale. I want to try to get rid of the lines as much as possible. So using that negative space can be a really helpful tool in finding specific shapes. Now we see a merging here between, and we see this shadow form, but in terms of value, it also tends to merge with that distant tree line there. So I'm just kind of slowing down, trying to think again about the edges, try to find the sharper edges and distinguish them from the softer edges. And we see another shadow shape here. Actually, I want to switch my mark since it's the vertical grass is the shadows being cast upon. I want to switch the direction of my marks, and I want to find the direction of these marks here. Now we have this kind of shadow underneath here that it's really broken up by the grass, and so it's a very subtle edge. But what I want to do is map out the basic direction of that shadow, keeping that edge soft. Using angle sighting to kind of scope the angles there. And then pivoting to this vertical edge here. And I'm not being super careful. It's not a sharp edge because that's all obscured by various lengths of grass. And we'll get in there and create the transparency of that a little bit later. Okay. Now, let's see. Well, I'm glad that connected with you, the idea of finding edges. I'm glad this is helpful. And Mary, I appreciate your comments as well. Daniela, welcome from Brazil. And then Saman from Kurdistan. Welcome, welcome. All right, I think where I'm at right now, what am I thinking right now? I have to ask myself that question, reorient myself. I think I want to start moving into texture at this point. And in order to do that, I think what I'd like to do is spend a little bit more time in the sky, smoothing it out. You can see I've got this slight dark halo here that I want to get rid of. But I want to start to smooth things out because I like that contrast between that smooth sky and then the rough hay there that's all baled up. So as I try to smooth this out, I'm just using the weight of the pencil, changing up the direction of my marks, and it's all about creating multiple passes, as many passes over this area as you can, and slowly building that up. When you find an area that's a little bit too light, you can slow down and try to fill it in, and then again feather it out. And I'm identifying areas that are kind of too dark that I'll come back in later with the blending stump. And also I want to try to observe the gradation in the sky from the horizon upward, where it gets a little bit darker towards the top of the sky here. There's a color and value shift from the sky, from the horizon to the zenith. So what we see is a desaturation of the hues along the horizon. Sometimes it's a little cooler, sometimes it's actually a little warmer, depending on what's in the atmosphere. And then as you transition from the horizon upward, you pass through various temperatures of that blue. Often it's a little bit cooler and higher saturation right in here along the central band, and then it moves up where it gets darker and more violet. Now, one of the things that's also happening is I'm calibrating to the values that are on the page. In that, you know, I'm looking at the lightest light and the darkest darks, and I can feel my brain adjusting to those. So this is really interesting. Like right here, from my perspective here, that's a beautiful transition. I look up, and there is a bit of a kind of a blotchy quality to it that I want to adjust. And again, I'm going to be using the vertical interpretation. So with this kneaded eraser, I've just softened it. I've created this soft pad, and I'm just tapping kind of lightly and quickly, and kind of adjusting the tone there. I just want to, it doesn't have to be perfect in my view. Actually, I prefer sky gradations that are slightly imperfect, because that feels like the experience of looking at the sky, where we, you know, our retina is being blasted by the brightness of the sky often, and the rods and the cones in our retina get a little tired and fatigued, get excited, and it can create the impression of kind of dark and light spots in the sky. And so that's why I don't necessarily aim for a precise gradation there, super smooth, because that's not really the experience we have when looking. But again, that's just my way of thinking about it. Okay, how's that feel? All right, that feels a little bit better. Jane is asking about color temperature, if I can talk about that. I'm switching to the 6B right now, just so you know, and I'm going to refine this background while I talk about color temperature. Color temperature is really challenging, and I had it wrong for a very long time. And I don't know if I really have it now. But as you know, we can look at a color wheel, and we can identify warm colors and cool colors, where the warm colors are the reds, oranges, and yellows. The cooler colors are complementary to that, the blues, kind of the violet, the blue-green. And then you have the kind of the colors that are kind of in the middle there, green and purple. Now, what I've as a landscape painter, what is ultimately most useful to me to know is about the fall off of certain temperatures as they recede from you. So, you know, we understand the sky to be blue because as the white light of the sun enters our atmosphere, it's making contact with all the particles in the atmosphere, and that light is scattering, and it's the blue wavelengths that make it through to us. Now, with atmospheric perspective, what's happening is certain wavelengths of light are falling off as you recede. So what happens is that the yellow wavelengths are generally weaker. They are the first ones to fall off. And as you recede, you're left with the violets that are kind of the last ones to fall off, kind of the complement to that. And so what can be difficult in landscape painting is again, our brains are always trying their best to give us the information that is useful to us. and that's not necessarily the optical information. It's not what it actually looks like. So if we see, these trees here in this reference image are close enough where we can still interpret some of the yellow. The yellow hasn't fallen off. You see in the ground plane a lot of warmth, right? There's a lot of the yellows and oranges and reds infusing that. And now imagine opening up that space and pushing all of this stuff back and those yellow and orange wavelengths falling off. What would you be left with in these greens here? You'd actually be left with a lot of blues and kind of violets, purples. And so you're kind of cooling things off. You're being left with more of the violets there, the blue violets, as you recede. And that's why here in Colorado, we look out of the mountains and they're all purple. They're the purple mountains, right? Purple Mountain Majesty, and the amber waves of grain. That was written here in Colorado. Or at least about Pikes Peak is my understanding. And they become purple because at a distance, it's the purple wavelength that's able to make it that distance. The yellows and the oranges have trailed off. But again, going back to what's useful to us, what will happen sometimes is, those trees are distant, but we're still thinking, or part of our brain is still thinking green. Because we know that they're trees, and it's weird to think of blue and violet trees. So that's the way I think about it, is more about what temperatures are falling off at a distance. But in general, when you're cooling down a color, you're adding more blue to it, blue or violet. And when you're warming up a color, you're adding more reds, yellows, and oranges to it. And then greens are really tricky because they are, again, that tertiary color that can be shifted very easily from a warm to a cool version by simply adding more yellow to oranges to make it warm, bring it closer to you, or adding more blue and violet to push it away. All right, so again, I'm using the 6B pencil here just to refine that shape of the horizon line. And I'm getting kind of roughly close, but I don't want to spend a whole lot of time matching the reference image one-to-one. And I'm going to keep it at that. There's going to be some darker darks I'm going to add. Leslie just started finished painting a series of hay bales here in New Zealand. That's awesome. Nia is asking what I'm drawing with colored pencils. It is actually a floral. So I was sent a set of Prismacolor pencils that I'm reviewing right now for Artist Network, and I am drawing an image of a lady slipper. It's a flower that's kind of found in the Northeast. It was one of my favorite things to discover walking through the woods of Maine when I was growing up. So I chose that, and I'm trying to really kind of experience those Prismacolor pencils. Let's see, and then Paul is asking me how I feel about these pencils. Are they reminiscent of charcoal at all, thinking they offer a range of value that charcoal doesn't, but with a matte finish? Yeah, I think they're still very much a graphite pencil. Yeah, they just don't quite have the shine. What I really like about them, though, is they're super smooth. There's like no imperfections. They're not scratchy at all. That's why I like the softer graphites in general. And these ones here are really nice and smooth. And I do like that they are less reflective than other graphite. And sharpening them, they really did choose a good quality wood. It's good stuff. And I like the range of values. I don't know. I still think I would lean towards charcoal when I really want to push that value range to get a darker dark. But if you prefer graphite, I'd say give these a shot. Greetings from Istanbul, Galip. Welcome. And then Peters, when do you see when your drawing is finished? That's a good, I'm going to be bringing that up as I get closer, but it's a really good question, and one that we get asked a fair amount is, how do you know when you're done? Part of that is in identifying in the onset of your drawing what your kind of objectives are. What is your threshold going to be with regards to accuracy? What kind of experience are you looking for out of the drawing process? And kind of sticking to that. So for example, if you feel like you need to be more expressive today, then what you might be evaluating is the expressive quality of your drawing, and that's going to determine whether or not you're done. Have you reached the level of expressivity that you're intending? Or if you're going for detail, quality of light, texture, etc. If you feel like you've met those things, that generally becomes the standard by which you measure the completion of the drawing. I will often, for me, drawing and painting is about understanding the subject better, and so that will often lead it. Sometimes the painting itself doesn't look great, but I've understood something more about the subject, and I may stop there and call it done. All right, so here it's a really delicate balance. I'm going to darken that background again, switching to those vertical marks. And I want to just be careful not to create too strong of a line back in there. So just creating a value contrast and lightening up that edge of the line there. Now I'm going to intentionally kind of leave some of the marks here visible. So you saw that I used my blending stump for the trees, again, as a way to create some contrast and texture. And I may do some blending here, but I want to use the tooth of the paper to my advantage as well. And I haven't done a lot of subtractive drawing, but that's going to be a big part of the process as we get farther in. I'm just kind of roughing in that shape, and if anything, I want to keep this a little less finished to help push it back farther. Now, so with the 6B, it allows me to go a little bit darker than the other, but I know I can go even darker with the 14B. And right in here, I've switched to this tripod grip to give myself a little bit more control. And I have that sharp point because I've been using the side of the pencil. So I try to reserve that sharp point for just a few key areas, otherwise use that side of the pencil. And so right now I'm actually sharpening the pencil as I go so that I don't end up having to stop the drawing process in order to sharpen. So just going a little bit darker, and that's creating the sensation of light on those background trees by now having that shadow back in there. And as I work up to this edge, it's really kind of broken up by some of that straw, some of that hay. And we'll try to address that a little bit. So doing a little bit of negative space, negative drawing there. Okay. And then this feels a little too high. I'm going to bring that down because this thing's really squished into the ground, and I wasn't thinking about that when I made those marks initially. And I'm saving my rubber eraser here. I have that really sharp edge. I'm saving that for later. I'm doing what I can with the kneaded eraser for now. All right, now I'm going to continue to refine this edge here. Again, kind of moving back and forth, in and out, away from that edge and up to it to find that edge. And this is where now I'm using the larger reference. I have one in the screen in front of me here, and I can engage with the details a little bit more. So I can, when I'm looking at the reference, just isolate this one little area, make a quick observation, and then come back to the drawing and work it a bit without having to worry about it maintaining the context of the whole drawing. Right? So that's the challenge, is if I haven't built up all of that context, as soon as you start to engage with those finer details, those finer refinements, it makes it very difficult to maintain an awareness of the whole. All right, so actually I think what I need to do is I'm going to bring in this blending stump. To answer that other question too about these pencils, what I like about this is that it creates a wonderful powder on the page that I can push around with a blending stump really easily. I love it. So by filling this in here, I'm ultimately going to build up darker layers. So with the blending stump, as I encounter this edge here, I need to slow down my observations a little bit and really track that edge, because there's some areas where that shadow comes in contact with the edge and you can see it really wraps around that form. And there's some areas where that light is the strongest. Here it transitions into light, but then as we move farther back, that shadow kind of takes over. And this is one of the advantages to working with a well-used tortillon is that it becomes a really effective mark-making tool. So while I have this here, I'll start to indicate some of the kind of darker spots in the hay there. There are these kind of larger shadow areas. And so you can see that I'm not creating marks that go all the way around here. I'm breaking up those forms. And if you break up the forms enough, it'll all accumulate together to create the impression of kind of a circular texture. And you can start to really experience how the hay is kind of pinwheeling out from the center here. Again, I'm looking for the larger shapes of light and shadow. You know, here it's a little bit darker. The light catches more here and here. Kind of saying this out loud for myself. Don't be afraid to talk out loud, you know, think out loud as you're working, even if it feels weird. That's one of the benefits to me doing this live, is that by being able to articulate my thoughts, it holds me accountable, and it forces me to think about what I'm doing before I do it, because so much of the art making process can be somewhat intuitive. And when you challenge your intuitions, that's when you can sometimes come up with something really, really effective in kind of defining your unique process. So this technique with the blending stump is to use the long edge of that tip and really try to drag it and push it and just keep rotating it in my fingers to you know, so that I'm not developing kind of these flat spots there. So using the blending stump, it's not about smoothing this area out, it's about mark making, and it's just creating a more gentle mark. Leslie, it looks like you're creating clouds with the kneaded eraser. That's awesome. Let's see. Nell is asking, when you do art, how can you start defining your own style? That's a good question. I try not to spend much time thinking about style, so I may not be the right person to answer this, but I can give you my thoughts. Yeah, to me, I feel like style is ultimately something like body language or your vocal tone, right? You can improve your posture. You can be more intentional with body language. You can take singing lessons and learn how to hit notes differently, and you can improve your singing, but there's always going to be a unique tone that is yours. And it's the same with handwriting and, again, body language and other things. And I believe that that's ultimately where style kind of emerges. There's a natural body language that is expressed through your mark making. Right? So that's one aspect to it. Also, where style comes into play is it's a reflection of the decisions you're making about the subject. What is important to you as an artist that might be different than somebody else's? If you move into that by forcing it, though, I think it can sometimes come back to bite you. I think ultimately what you're looking for to define your style is a sense of confidence that the things that you're interested in, the way you're working with the materials, is unique to you. And that's what you're ultimately mastering. And it does become a way for people to identify you, especially as they start collecting your work. But I also feel like to some degree you can't avoid it. Style will always come through. Your unique touch on the work will always be visible. So you don't necessarily need to force it. But that, I also want to kind of say that can be very different, from my perspective as a more traditional fine artist. Once you start entering into illustration and graphic design, and then you layer on also the style that's right for the work that you're doing, what you're being hired to create. And their style may be really important to be able to show a range of styles. I think commercial art it's a very challenging field to get into, and requires a lot of skill, but I think it changes the context for style, and the importance of it. I can be free to kind of develop my own style here because I really only do work for myself at this point. If I were creating illustrations or working for somebody else, I might feel a greater pressure to define style, and in which case I think, just like really any other art form, the more you can expose yourself to other works, the better. Just immerse yourself in it, and what the work that really you connect with will help you to define your own style. But like I said, I think what I look for is just, again, the natural body language and the movement of the materials merging with the decisions you make as the artist. That ultimately becomes the style. All right. I couldn't really get into, Jackie is saying I couldn't really get into the matte pencils, just felt I couldn't get darks. Oh, that's interesting. Your husband likes them. And then Jane's been experimenting with colored pencils over graphite. Yeah, that sounds great. I have a little bit of a graphite kind of line work that I created, and I'm doing the colored pencil on top. The challenging part for me is really understanding the translucency of colored pencils, just because there's watercolor, which is translucent. You have semi-opaque, you have transparent. It's all kind of a translucent medium, but it also, you can lift watercolor a little bit more easily. And yeah, colored pencil just feels a bit more permanent. Okay. And then Dallas. I'm working on a drawing of my brother Aaron, who died in '92. I'm using colored pencils. Oh, nice. I'm excited to see that portrait. I see your name there, and it sounds like the same name as the podcast I like to listen to, 20,000 Hertz. It's a great podcast. I believe the host has that same name, which is very cool. Nell is saying, like you do landscapes, how do you find what is your strength? Let's see. So my approach to drawing and painting is that ultimately it's about a set of decisions. It's the decisions you make to break down the subject, right? And I like to tell myself that, I could apply the same thinking to landscapes as I do to portraits and still life, etc. And I try to do that, but some are just more effective than others. I spend more time with the landscape so I can make quicker decisions there. What drives it for me is ultimately I've always connected with the landscape. It's being in the landscape that becomes a form of meditation for me, and it just naturally merged with the painting. That's how I really started painting and drawing, is trying to, as I was in the landscape, I started to really observe what things looked like, and then when I started painting, I realized that just helped me get to that faster. I think having a personal connection to the subject and the subject matter, I think can be really helpful. And there are a lot of great painters that, did it all, and some that just got connected to a single subject. And sometimes you follow the interests that, a painting might generate, and maybe it leads to a series, and then you move from that. One of the reasons I also started working in the landscape is that I didn't have a studio space to work in for a very long time. And so it was just the outdoors became my studio, and I liked being outside. I liked hiking around and discovering spots. And I know some portrait painters, I know Gustavo Ramos talked about it in that last Illuminate event. He was compelled to work with portraits because when he moved to the United States from Brazil when he was younger, he had a hard time really understanding people, just their language, and it forced him to become more attuned to body language. And so I think a lot of it, again, just kind of personal interest. And I think one of the tools that you can use to discover that is to look at other art and see what art you can really connect with. And that was the other thing too, is I would find myself compelled to look at landscape paintings more than I did any other subject matter. I grew up with landscape paintings in the house that I would just stare at, or I would, Neil Welliver is a great landscape painter that when I saw, I just couldn't stop looking at them. There's something about that experience that compelled me to get sucked into the painting. But that doesn't happen with all paintings. And so when I was trying to reflect on why is it that painting versus another, and it's keeping me engaged, then that led to it. Also the challenge of it, sometimes I want a challenge and that'll lead me to one subject. Sometimes I don't want a challenge and it'll lead me to another. If I want a challenge, I'll work on a portrait because I really have to think more than I do with a landscape, if that makes sense. So good question. Let's see. Oh, Stonehenge, that would be a great style. Getting back to that style. Oh, so Saman has a comment. A style is the mistake that you choose to leave in when you draw. If you draw something right, it will look photorealistic. Comic book artist said that, and I think it was Neil Adams. Oh, interesting. Yeah, kind of getting back to style. One of the quotes that really stood out to me was from the painter Alex Katz, who, his objective was, and I'm not going to say his quote specifically because I don't remember it specifically, but the gist of it is that you ultimately find the way that you use the materials and then you master that. And that's what he did. He created these giant kind of color-filled pop art portraits that were just, I don't know from a technical standpoint how those are created. I mean, and the same with Neil Welliver. He had the ability to float one color on top of another and in a way that was just unique to him. And that was really kind of engaging. And then he found subject matter, and his way of identifying composition was unique. But subject matter was pretty common. I mean, he's just doing landscapes, right? Nothing inventive there. But I think part of what defines style is a sense of honesty and authenticity. And this is who I am as an artist and what I'm interested in. Letting things come out of that. All right, so what I think I need to do now, what do I need to do? I'm going to work this ground plane a little bit more. And Bramble is saying, style and technique are two different things. Yes, I think they overlap and to some degree, but they are different things, I would agree. And Dallas saying, when I'm drawing, I always try to make my drawing pop off the paper. Like when I'm drawing a heart, I draw an apple first, and then I turn my apple into a heart so it pops off the page. Oh, that's very cool. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it just is, we each have things that we think about. And that's something that I would also use as well, is like, I would find myself naturally thinking about landscape painting and landscapes and saying, oh, I want to experience such and such a landscape. I want to find the perfect eastern white pine, or I want to find, I want to go out in the grasslands here in Colorado and experience that. And I would find myself just kind of thinking and daydreaming about those things. Far more than, I very rarely think of, find myself kind of daydreaming about painting portraits. So as I tackle the grass, you can see that I'm still using the 6B, and I'm using this overhand grip. I'm aligning the core of the pencil vertically. That's the general thrust of the grass, right? And I'm looking for kind of broad areas of light and dark because it's not a consistent, it's not just a consistent tone. There's lots of variation. But within that, you know, this is generally lighter, this is generally darker. And as I'm making these marks, I'm creating a bit of a kind of a rocking motion. So it's kind of scooping a little bit. And I'm rolling the pencil in between my fingers, and it's creating some of these marks here. Now, I'm not matching the marks one-to-one, but I do want to look at the reference image. I want these marks to be informed by the reference. So in general, I see kind of a darker path in through here, and I'm noting that the grass gets progressively taller. So as I recede, maybe I tighten up my marks. I'm making just kind of smaller, tighter marks in there. And as I move forward and as I advance along that ground plane, I'm opening them up and making them a little bit larger. And so some of these marks I'm pulling, some of them I'm pushing. And I'm looking for kind of an irregular rhythm, and then gauging the marks as I look up at the image. I'm trying to see, is it starting to create some sort of quality of advancing along that ground plane? And you can see that I've got, while I'm making these vertical marks, I'm moving horizontally, kind of laterally across the page. And it can be helpful to squint, to reduce the details, to see what stands out. Now, as we enter into the shadow area, I'm going to be looking for some variation within that shadow to help to create that transparency. Now, what I want to be careful of is I don't want to change the direction of my mark within the shadow. So if I'm using vertical marks here, I want vertical marks in the shadow. That, if we recall what we were saying earlier in the session, because those marks are running in the same direction, it's easier for the viewer's mind to accept as belonging together. In this case, the shadow is part of the ground plane. Even though I drew it as part of this singular shape, it's technically part of the ground plane, and I want that to be viewed together. It's just a darker part of that ground plane. If I change up the direction of my marks, what it tells the viewer is that because the marks run in different directions, they must be different themselves. And it creates a visual separation that makes it seem like it's its own shape, not simply a transparent layer where that shadow is casting over that grass, if that makes sense. Ooh, a blood moon. That would be an interesting subject. So down in here, we see some lighter grass marks that come in on top of the shadow. I'm going to ignore those for now, or I'm going to extract those later on. But I mean, the key right now is I'm looking at that edge. How we tackle that shadow edge is really going to be important in terms of suggesting the transparency of it all. And if it doesn't read as transparent, it's going to read as an opaque shape, as though it's kind of painted on that surface, and it's going to kind of kick us out of the reality of it all. All right, so as I move down into this open space too, I'm just carrying those same marks, just getting bigger and bigger as I advance. And what I see is that there's a general darkening, a vignetting in a way of the grass down in this lower corner. can change up the direction of my marks there a little bit. And I don't want to spend too much time on the grass. We're an hour and 40 minutes in, and I want to make sure that we really engage with the texture of the hay. That's such a key aspect of this. So hopefully, I want to, this edge is going to be tricky, so I want to, make sure that I get those values right. I'm actually going to do a little bit of blending there. I can drop that down and then layer in some additional texture here for the grass. Going to reestablish the verticality of it all. I'm just switching to this tripod grip because I'm having a hard time contorting myself. I think I should tone this whole area and then quickly come in and reestablish more verticality here. I think what's really critical is getting, along, again, this edge here. So some of these marks are accidental, and that's okay. And again, they're not matching the reference image one-to-one, but this becomes more of an impression of that ground plane. Sometimes what I like to think about when I'm working on the ground plane is envisioning a grid across that surface. That can be helpful sometimes. So we know the perspective here, and that can inform the direction of my marks, even if it's just a loose suggestion, right? Just to reinforce that ground plane. So here it's going to be horizontal. As we work our way down, it becomes increasingly slanted, and it's, again, just a kind of a rough expression of a ground plane there, but it can sometimes be enough to pop that forward, so it doesn't feel like a wall that this thing is sitting on, but it's an actual ground plane. The grass moves in all sorts of different directions, so you can change up those directions. Change up the height of these marks. And what I'm looking for is just enough finish so it doesn't become distractingly unfinished. Because I do want to make sure that the hay bale becomes really the prime subject of this. All right, I think that's good enough for now. I'll get working on those hay bales. Let's see, all right. I guess what I'll do is I'll work on this light side first, and what I'm gonna do is that same kind of technique as I was using with the grass, using this overhand grip. You can make really fine marks that way. And what I want to try to do is be kind of mindful of the overall curve that I'm trying to achieve here. you know, when I was working with that blending stump, I was being a bit too casual with it. And I'm trying to see where is it a little bit darker. So like right in here, it's darkening up a bit. And so I'll mix some of these marks here with that tripod grip with with the overhand grip, because that variety is really important. In this way, we want to be more suggestive of that texture than highly explicit with it. So this requires a little bit more kind of focus and attention. So I'm doing a little less talking than normal, but and what I like about this, if you keep these marks really kind of short and kind of focused, you can really build it up fairly quickly and kind of capture the irregularity of it all. So I'm really trying to break up that edge along here, because from a distance we see that it's a kind of a clear cylindrical form, but as you really look at that edge, it's really kind of broken up. So how's everybody else's drawing coming along? I hope everybody gets a chance to share their work on Artist Network when it's all done. This chair is getting a little uncomfortable for me. I know that's one of the hard parts of drawing and painting, is it can be hard on the body. So much standing and sitting still. So along this edge, it's a little bit more delicate because we have much less contrast. So I'm going to take my time along in here and try to really observe where the edge is more clear, where is it more diffused. Here I'm going to have to kind of contort myself. But if I wasn't taped down to the table, I would be rotating the paper. That's all right. It helps me to. This is where it helps with the hand-eye coordination. Kind of forcing yourself into uncomfortable situations can sometimes be a great way to discover new mark making and build confidence in your marks. So. And I'll switch to this tripod grip, get a few marks in here. And what I'm trying to do is, one of the things that could be helpful is to look indirectly. Use that indirect gaze we talk about here in the show quite a bit, is the idea that, you know, if this is my target area, that's what I'm ultimately trying to solve the problem of. You'll find that sometimes you get better information by actually fixing your gaze on things that are adjacent to it. So when I'm looking at the reference image, I might look here, but put my awareness on this area. And in that way, it can sometimes highlight areas that need work. Or you might see subtle shifts in value that you may otherwise lose when you're looking directly at it. Because that center of focus and that center of our field of vision where we're bringing things into sharp focus is ultimately designed to interpret detail and texture at the expense of accurate value and color relationships. So you get better information about the value or the color of a specific area by putting your center of vision adjacent to it, not directly on that target. What you lose, though, is some of that detail, which you might need. So that's why you kind of piece it all together. You get good at modulating your vision so that you have this balance between sharp focus and blurred, squinted eyes, indirect gazes versus looking directly. You want to do it all. And the more we remain fixed on a subject too, the more fatigued our retina becomes. The rods and the cones in our retina become kind of fatigued and adjusting, and they adjust to the light conditions, the intensity, the value and color relationships. And we actually become less effective observers when we fix our gaze too long at something. So that's why it's really important to step away from your work, step away from the subject. I did a painting yesterday of a subject that I had done a painting of the same painting a couple weeks ago, and over time I became less satisfied with it. So I thought, well, I'll take it back out and I'll repaint it, and I'm just much happier with it. I saw things in the finished work that I had become blind to during the actual painting session. All right, so hopefully this is giving you enough of an idea about how to kind of suggest that texture along the front. You know, as I come through here, I'm doing the same thing. I really want to make sure that I'm wrapping around the contour of that hay bale. So it's just this kind of sawing motion. And then trying to identify, well, where's some variety here, really wrapping up around that edge, create that turning edge. And some of those stray straw pieces are kind of flicking outward. Switching to this overhand grip again so that I can sharpen the pencil for when I need it later. And here it gets kind of darker towards the back. So one of the things that's kind of happening too is with this overhand grip, I'm catching some of the wood, and that slightly embosses the paper, and it creates an interesting mark that you might be able to utilize later on. Hopefully it'll show up when I bring in the darkest of the pencils here. All right, so now as I darken this base of the hay bale, you can see how now it's turning this into that bounce light, that reflected light. It's creating that contrast. So what once was the darkest dark is now not the darkest dark. Darkest dark is down here. And that's really critical for creating that form. It's creating those changes along the form that suggest this three-dimensional quality. So I'm just trying to rotate my motions a bit. And one thing to kind of have in your mind is kind of what we did here when I was darkening this horizon line here and gradually adjusting the angle of my mark so that it aligned with that base perspective. There's a change in curve from the foreground to the background. It's not a perfectly parallel curve because of the rules of perspective. So this is a bit more squished, and this becomes more open back in here. So as you're creating your cross contour textural hatch marks here, you kind of think about that, you know, that the curve back here is slightly different than up here. So you're going to be kind of working your way across. So I don't, for example, if I carry the same angle across here, now I'm putting marks in that really move away from that edge. So I need to have them radiate a bit around the natural perspective of that hay bale. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to keep bouncing around the form here. Kind of indicating more of those cross contour marks here. And I think what I need is a bit more, kind of more texture back in here, more information back there. Yeah, so in this way, I'm really trying to let the materials do some of the work for me. And then the final step will be to bring in the eraser. I guess maybe not the final step, but close to it. I want to build up the darks before I lift the lights. All right, my retractable Derwent eraser. So I have it shaved down to this chisel tip. It gives me this sharp, flat edge. That works great for lifting off some of these kind of finer highlights. I'm going to start with this foreground highlight because I want my brightest brights to be here against that dark edge. That'll bring that front corner forward more. It'll advance that a little bit more. And I'm going to look for highlights along in this area as well. Again, just kind of suggesting more than anything. Kind of working my way around it. And then as I encounter the top here, there's a nice light that's striking across the top there. And I'm going to bring those lights down to meet that cross contour curve there. And I think this has become a bit too ambiguous along that edge, so I just need to have a little bit more of those shadow lines established up here. And that gives a little bit more form to that front edge, hopefully without kind of dishonoring the value relationships that I'm seeing in the reference. Remember that we have a color shift here, the blue to orange in the reference image that we don't have at our disposal for this black and white drawing. So I'm kind of making some stuff up. This is largely in shadow. The highlights are stronger here. Hopefully this is all making sense. I do think I need to come in here and add a little bit more sharpness. All right, now let's see, I can see about the light on this front corner of this bale back in here, see if that does anything. Oh, I like that. Lift a little bit. I'm not really scraping along here, I'm just kind of pressing and lifting with a kneaded eraser to lift a little bit of line there. Now, with this light here on the ground plane, I'm just going to throw in some additional marks here with the eraser to hopefully kind of reinforce some of the light on the grass. So the same thing, I want to be thinking about scale, that these marks here are bigger because it's closer to us than what we're seeing in the background. And I'm just going to kind of lightly suggest the variety of marks in this foreground area. So by lifting with the eraser into that shadow area, it helps to bring that ground plane in front. Here, I'm just be a little bit lighter with my eraser, so the highlights aren't quite as strong. I'm going to just kind of suggest some light striking the grass here. And if you play around with the pressure, of your eraser, you can create some really interesting effects. You know, if a light pressure will blend them a little bit. Add essentially a layer of cross-hatching. And heavier pressure, of course, will lift off more. We have some of this straw here that's kind of laying down in the grass. I'm just going to change the direction of the marks there. And that helps to provide a little bit more structure to that ground plane. But I know time is running a little long here, so I want to wrap this up pretty soon. So I'm just kind of roughing in this ground plane. So hopefully that's been effective for you for the other parts. The final thing is, where is it? My 14B, my darkest dark. I'm going to bring that in here. Is that really? Yeah, that's showing up. All right. It's hard to tell. This is a matte pencil, but it there still gets some sort of reflection. It's just not nearly as reflective as a traditional charcoal or graphite pencil. I'm going to bring up some more of the dark in the foreground, the forward part of the cylinder than in the back. And I'm just kind of smoothing out that transition, varying the marks. If I wanted to pop this corner here, I could add a little bit of that over here. To suggest some of that negative space. All right. add just a little bit of depth here to this shadow. And I can bring this whole thing forward by darkening this section here. Let's see what that does. Kind of curious. And so with these darkest darks, it can be really effective just to use it sparingly in some areas, just to bring the impression of sharpness into the drawing. But like I said earlier, this is hopefully setting you up to continue on if you wanted to add more refinement, make this an even more detailed piece and really want to get into that texture. If you do, just keep in mind that you want to be really utilizing that texture to reinforce the form, observing how it's connected to the form. It's not something that's applied later. It's all part of it. And actually, I'm gonna bring some of the darker darks into this shadow core. Ooh, there goes tip of the pencil. And then just let that kind of feather out, so I'm not bringing too much attention to this contrast over there. So I hope this has been helpful. I think we'll call it a day. I'm gonna beat for today, but this has been a blast. I'll hang this on the screen a little bit while I read some of the comments here. Let's see. Reading some of the questions here. I've not tried working on a gaming chair. I had a stool that broke and that worked better. So I think I just need to get a better one that has a bit better back support, but I appreciate that. I should give that a shot. Usually when I'm painting or drawing, I'm standing up and I can move around a lot more, and that's helpful. I'm glad this has been helpful. Oh, then Paul is saying the hay pattern reminds me of the golden spiral as a compositional element with a rule of thirds. Yeah, very similar to the rule of thirds. It's like 1 to 1.6 is the ratio between them with the golden ratio, but you get that interesting spiraling effect, which is kind of cool. Jackie, I'm glad that you like this. I'm working on next episodes. My goal is for next week to have another Art of the Steel in series, so the series of master copies that we've been doing. So I'm looking for a good reference right now, an artist that we haven't worked with, so I'm mulling a few over right now, but hopefully that will be posted this week, so keep an eye out for that. And I want to give everybody a heads up. One of the things we're talking about here as we approach our 150th episode is trying to do something special for that 150th episode, and I may take a bit of a break from the live streams for a little while to allow me to work on some other video projects. The idea is that I'm trying to provide more content on YouTube, more free content for people. And so I need some time to kind of work through some of those issues and try things out. So we're working on some of those ideas. I just want to make sure that you're all subscribed and set up for our newsletter so that you can stay informed about changes that might be making. Stay tuned also on Artist Network. If you're an Artist Network member, we have an upcoming Illuminate event. Next month will be Brienne Brown. She's a great watercolor artist, and we're working on that product right now. We're going to figure out what she's going to be talking about for that. So I want to again thank you all. This has been a fantastic chat. Great questions today. I'd love to see your drawings on the site, so be sure to check the description below. If you haven't liked this video, be sure to like, subscribe, do all those things. Find the reference image and the link to the show page on Artist Network in the description below. Let's see. Oh, Edie is saying H.R. Geiger. That would be an interesting one. Unfortunately, I have to be careful about copyright issues, so I have to choose images that were created long enough ago where I don't have to worry about those things. Even though these are generally free, I don't want to I don't want to mess with copyright stuff. So all of these images I either take myself, or a lot of them I find on royalty-free, copyright-free sites. But Geiger would be a lot of fun to do. All right. Well, thank you all. I hope you have a fantastic week along and a good weekend. I'm grateful for the rain we have here in Colorado, but I do hope it lightens up so I can get out and do more painting. So, all right.